President Ferdinand E. Marcos assumed power on December 30, 1965, and became the second president re-elected to office in 1969. There were efforts to maneuver the 1971 Constitutional Convention to permit his continuing in office. With the swell of student radicalization and increasing number of violent demonstrations, Marcos played up middle-class fears and used these to justify the imposition of martial law on September 23, 1972 by virtue of Proclamation No. 1081. Martial law was not just an invocation of the president's emergency powers under the 1935 Constitution. Marcos went further to assume all governing powers, excluded civilian courts, and systematically replaced the 1935 Constitution with the 1973 Constitution for his own ends. The replacement of the Constitution was done under dubious circumstances. First, Marcos ordered a viva voce plebiscite on January 10 to 15, 1973, in which the voting age was reduced to 15 to ratify the new constitution, and military men were placed prominently to intimidate voters. Reports indicated that mayors and governors were given quotas for yes votes on the constitution, and negative votes were often not recorded. Results report that 90% of the citizens have voted for the Constitution, even though some communities did not participate in the citizens' assemblies. Over the next few years, Marcos would hold 4 more plebiscites in 1973, 1975, 1976, and 1978 through citizen assemblies to legitimize the continuation of martial rule. Second, he intimidated the Supreme Court to approve the Constitution. Using stick and carrot method on the justices of the Supreme Court, President Marcos was able to force the Supreme Court to uphold martial law and the new constitution. Previously, around 8,000 individuals, including senators, civil libertarians, journalists, students, and labor leaders, were arrested and detained without due process upon the declaration of martial law, with many of them filing petitions to the Supreme Court for habeas corpus. They challenged the constitutionality of the proclamation. However, the Supreme Court issued its final decision in Havillana versus Executive Secretary, which validated the Constitution. This would be the final legitimizing decision on the constitutionality of martial law. On September 17, 1974, the Supreme Court dismissed petitions for habeas corpus by ruling that martial law was a political question beyond the jurisdiction of the court, and that furthermore, the court had already deemed the 1973 Constitution in full force and effect, replacing the 1935 Constitution. After the landmark decision, Chief Justice Roberto Concepcion went into early retirement 50 days before his originally scheduled retirement date in silent protest over the majority in the Havillana versus Executive Secretary case. He argued against the validity of the new Constitution and its questionable aspects, together with Justices Claudio Tihanqui, Calixto Zaldivar, and Enrique Fernando. Martial law imposed government control over all forms of media. On September 22, 1972, Marcos issued Letter of Instruction No. 1 ordering the Press Secretary and Defense Secretary to assume control over all media outlets. All periodicals were padlocked, and media personalities who had criticized Marcos, his family, or his administration were taken to Camp Crame without any charges being filed. Among them were publishers Joaquin Chino Rosas of Manila Times, Eugenio Lopez of Manila Chronicles, and columnists Max Sullivan and Luis Beltran. Marcos issued at least 11 presidential decrees that suppressed press freedom. Journalists who did not comply with the new restrictions faced physical threats, libel suits, or forced resignation. With such stringent censorship regulations, most of the periodicals that were allowed to operate were crony newspapers.